Hello everyone and welcome to the WayWORD Festival and virtually to Aberdeen. The WayWORD Festival is brought to you by the Word Centre for Creative Writing with the generous support of Creative Scotland and the University of Aberdeen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel on fanfiction with three wonderful panelists. I am Miles Stevens, a recent Aberdeen University graduate whose creative writing portfolio dissertation was fanfiction. I'm joined by Dr. Liz Elliott, a senior lecturer of English at University of Aberdeen as my co-chair. Liz will be helping me moderate audience questions. Liz, if you just maybe want to pop on your camera for a second and wave at the audience. Hello, there she is, beautiful. There will be a Q&A at the end, so do feel free to pop questions into the Q&A box and also comments into the chat. You can find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can pop questions into the box throughout the panel. We will also be putting other info into the chat, so keep an eye on the chat as well. Our three panelists today will be Judith Fathallah, Katie Rathfelder, and MandalaRose. We will give them the opportunity to introduce themselves in just a minute. To give you a quick rundown of the overall format of the event, we will start with an introductory section where each of our panelists gets a couple of minutes to talk about themselves and talk about their relation to fanfiction. Then we will move on to the panel discussion itself. And lastly, we will open the floor for audience questions. So as I say, you can pop comments into the chat and questions into the Q&A box throughout the event. And Liz and I will keep an eye on them and feed them onto the panelists when the time comes. We are also delighted to have Leslie Crera with us today to provide BSL, that's British Sign Language interpretation. She will be spotlighted throughout the event, so you should always be able to see her. However, you can also pin Leslie so she always appears along with whoever is speaking, as long as your device allows this. Auto captions have also been enabled, and you can toggle them on and off with the CC button on the bottom right of your screen. Alrighty, time for some proper introductions. So welcome to each of you, Judith, Katie, and Mandala, and thank you so much for being with us here today. So let's begin with giving each of you a chance to introduce yourselves, talk about any recent, current, and/or upcoming projects and your personal relation to fanfiction. And so what I'm really interested in hearing from you is what drew you to fanfiction or fandom spaces in general in the first place, and how your relationship with that developed. And I would also like to know whether there is a particular fanfiction that you remember having a strong impact on you and that helped you grow your passion and your love for fanfic, and if so, why? So let's start with Judith then.
Hi, so I'm a research associate and research fellow who is divided between Lancaster and Coventry universities. And I've always been fascinated with digital and new media and the creative convergence of, if you like, amateur, I'm not sure about that word, or non-professional or user-generated content and media industry. At the same time, I'd always been interested in fandom and fan fiction from a personal perspective. And it was when I was studying English at university that I first began to think of fan fiction in terms of, firstly, the evolution of copyright and the idea of the author, and also in terms of the evolution of digital media and digital media forms, which is what led me to go on and write my PhD about it and ultimately to make my first book about it. So it was just sort of a coming together of my personal interest and my academic interest in a very fortuitous way. Ironically, I always say that if I hadn't become a postmodernist, I would have been a medievalist, because I feel like there's a surprising amount, when I think about fan fiction, there's a surprising amount of crossover between medieval kinds of communal writing and postmodern kinds of communal writing. And I'm also interested in experimental publishing, particularly open access and more innovative forms of publishing writing and communal ways of publishing writing. In terms of fan fictions that have had a particular impact on me, over the years, there have been so many, but I suppose I know that other people are going to talk, I think other people are going to talk about supernatural, so I'll make a supernatural reference because that has not so much anymore, but it used to be one of my main fandoms. And there's an absolutely amazing piece of multimedia fan fiction called Tons of Fields, which is a play on the novel House of Leaves, if you know that. And I would really, I mean, it's probably not the fan fiction I love the most, but it's probably the fan fiction that sort of expanded my thinking about what fan fiction is in some of the most interesting ways, and particularly its kind of use of multimedia and multimodalities.
Thank you. I'm just realizing now that actually asking you this question is basically just me going, give me more recommendations of fanfics I can read. So that's really good. We'll just move right on to Katie then.
All right, hi. So I write both fanfic and original work, and they've always been very tied up together for me. The people that I talk to about writing tend to be the people that I talk to about writing, whichever that happens to be. I primarily do a lot of editing work and what fandom calls beta editing. Again, both fanfic and original, and sort of have done for a terrifying number of years now. And that's definitely been a large part of sort of how I felt like I developed any sort of critical faculties in terms of understanding structure of a story, understanding how sentences work. So my current big project is editing a 60,000 word novel that two friends of mine have been writing for the last 2 years, set in the world of the TV show called The Untamed. Which you could describe as an epic drama based on a Chinese novel, or you could just say it's a love story about gay wizards in ancient China. And they're both true, and it's great. That's called Narrow Bridge, and it's just about to be finished posting, and I really recommend it because it's great. In terms of where I came from with respect to fanfic, I discovered it as a really young teenager. I must have been about 12 or 13. But I'm old enough that was a point when shipping something meant specifically Mulder and Scully from the X-Files. So I didn't understand for a good few months there that there was fan fiction about people who weren't Mulder and Scully from the X-Files. I thought that was a very unique sort of situation. And then I saw somebody mention Dawson's Creek / fanfic on a message board somewhere. And my mind immediately lit up with, one, that slash pairing that you just said is incorrect. I think you're clearly shipping the wrong people. And two, I was just so delighted to realize that it could be gay. I didn't know that. And I suddenly went, wow, that's brilliant. That's fantastic. And immediately went looking for queer fanfic about everything that I could possibly find. Because, yeah, I was just absolutely delighted to find that other people wanted to discuss something, you know, my favorite show or book or comic or whatever, and that you could do that in this really queer context and have fun with that and build on that in sort of in all sorts of different sort of creative ways. And I've just kept finding that really fun. I, you know, hope to be doing that when I'm at 90 if I can.
That's really lovely. Yeah, I very much feel that. We're definitely going to touch on that later on with queer representation in fanfiction, all of that, because that's also one of the things I'm very interested about. So I will definitely ask you about this. But before we get to that, Manda, I'll hand over to you.
Hello. I write under the name MandalaRose and go by Manda for short in most fandom spaces. So my journey to fandom and fan fiction, I think, is a little different in that I came to it rather late. Supernatural is my first true fandom. I've been a fan of things before, but I was, a casual fan. I'd watched the TV show, but I didn't know that fandom Twitter existed. I didn't know that message boards existed. And I found this by stumbling upon a very small Supernatural Facebook group. And I went, oh, that looks interesting. And I joined it and then learned there was this whole other world. But at first, I didn't read fan fiction. I had a very different understanding of fan fiction to what I do now. I knew that my fandom is Supernatural, and I write Destiel fan fiction, which is the pairing of the characters Dean and Castiel. I knew that that was a shift that people liked, but I had no particular feelings on it. I could see the reasons for it, I guess, but I had no real attachment to it until there was a particular scene in the show And it was the most cliched breakup scene between these two theoretically heterosexual characters that were both men that I've ever seen. I've lived that breakup scene. Okay, I've had that breakup. And I logged into my Facebook group and I said, okay, apparently Destiel is canon. So I'm gonna need all the fic recs, please, because I realized that there was clearly something I had missed. This is before I even knew what the word heteronormativity meant. This is back when I thought I was straight. So my understanding of the world as a whole and myself in particular were at a very different place. And I needed to find out what I had been missing all of those years. So I dove into fan fiction headfirst and really still haven't surfaced. Still took me about another year and a half to start writing. I didn't start writing my own fan fiction until, and I was in my mid 30s by this point. And I was in a very serious car accident, which, yes, I was temporarily physically disabled and used a wheelchair and mobility devices and had a 6-month recovery period. So it was a very life-altering experience. Had to be off work for 6 months. Obviously had a lot of free time to read fan fiction and read insane amounts of fan fiction at that point. But it got to a point where I really needed a way to kind of process what I had experienced. And I really, really hate journaling. So I didn't want to do that. But I like writing and I wanted a way to write that would give me a little bit of distance. And I was like, oh, there was a particular part of my rescue during my accident that people had made jokes to me, like, that sounds like a fan fiction. And I was like, you know what, it kind of does. And so 140,000 words later, I had written my first significant fan fiction and I just didn't stop after that. So that's kind of how I got here. I think for me, one of my favorite parts of fan fiction is the communal aspect. And really the fan fictions that have had the most impact on me are the ones where I get to see that and where I get to see more about the writer. So there have been so many. A couple that come to mind are the Down to Agincourt series by Separus, a very large, I think it's 600,000 words plus at this point. It's not finished. We're talking multiple very lengthy novels. And that was probably the first time that I really understood just how deep what people consider fan fiction can be. I mean, there are people who can't read this series because they're like, it's too academic, it's too wordy, there's a lot of history and mythology. And I really enjoy fics where I learn something new. So that one, and then Under the Midnight Sun by Northern Sparrow, I learned a lot about the Arctic and global warming from reading that story. And the thing that really drew me into both of those was that this is not something that you're going to see in published for-profit writing, because these were people who were really writing about what they were truly passionate about with no qualifiers, without having to worry about whether an audience was going to respond. They didn't have to worry about book sales. They didn't have to worry about a publishing company or an editor telling them to pull back on their passion. And these are people, some of them had written dissertations, which is a different kind of having to pull back, and you're writing for a different kind of audience. They were just truly writing not only about these characters and this show that they loved, but also about their personal passions with no filters. And there was just something so raw and beautiful about that. So that is really what pulled me in and why I'm here to stay.
Wonderful. I have heard of, I think, yeah, Down to Agincourt. I think at this point it's actually over 1 million words.
Oh, 1 million.
Which is why I haven't started yet, because I'm like, it's on my mark for later, but I'm like, oh boy. And I think that's also just stuff that you don't get. Like, that's just the fact that somebody sits down for fun, just does this, writes over 1 million words, because why not, is just something that is so absolutely amazing to me, and why I just really love fan fiction so much. But I'm going to take myself down a notch for a second, and just to get us started with the proper panel discussion. And I'm not entirely sure where our audience is going to stand in terms of, wait, what is fan fiction? What, how can we define it, and what is part of it, what isn't? So I think it might be interesting to start us off with what you would personally classify or not classify as fan fiction? How do you framework it? How do you define it? Because, you know, it's things like, is Dante's Inferno Bible, self-insert Bible fan fiction? Yes or no? Why not? You know, so whoever wants to go first can go first. If anyone immediately wants to jump in.
Okay, so I think that the definition actually depends on which perspective that you're taking, because I think that you can look at it sociologically, or you can look at it from a literary point of view. Or, I mean, obviously they're connected to each other, but I'm actually getting further away from the idea that fan fiction is a useful term. I think that its use is too broad and too kind of potentially broad that, I mean, so on the one hand, you can look at it in terms of its communal context of production as an unauthorized contribution to an already extant narrative from within a communal context of production. And then you have to start talking about the platforms that it appears on and the influence of the ways that it's written and the modes of publication on the final structure. Or, as you say, you can take a much, much broader perspective and think that any sort of unauthorized contribution to an already extant narrative is fan fiction, in which case literally anything that has ever been written is fan fiction forever. So I think if you want to define it, it probably has to be defined via its context of production and sociologically. But as I say, as a fan studies scholar, we are increasingly coming to question the word fan and whether it is even a useful term anymore, because its use is to so many different things that may bear only the vaguest resemblance to each other. So what I just want to say, if you want to define it, I think it should be defined by its context of productions, but I'm increasingly unsure about the term.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there, Judith. Because I've never really thought that fanfic is a genre in the way that some people sort of seem to try and discuss it. I've always thought of it as more like a medium, like the novel or comic book, where you've got potentially millions of things, infinite things that you could do with it. So you sort of have that where, as you say, almost anything could be a fanfic. You know, Chaucer wrote Virgil and Ovid fan fiction. You know, people don't talk about Clueless, the movie, as being Jane Austen fan fiction, but if you think of it sort of on one level, then yes, it is. But on the other, you have a very strict community that is defined by the people within it as being about fan fiction, and they use that word. And so I think I definitely agree that it depends on which of those things you actually want to talk about. Because for the specific group of people with you know, an internet connection and a lot of time on their hands, some of us, then that's useful for when you're talking in a much greater swathe. Well, I think sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's less useful. And I feel like getting too stressed about what counts as fanfic or not kind of defeats the point.
Yeah, I like that last point, Katie, that, you know, it's, if you're stressing about what is and is not fanfic, you're kind of missing the point of fan fiction, which is, you know, it's a celebration, it's a joyous thing, it's, you know, it's not meant to be limited and defined. It's people stepping outside of boxes in so many cases. And so why are we trying to build a very hard line box around it? I typically think of it more in terms of transformative fiction. And so if you're thinking, you know, what is transformative fiction? I mean, that dates back to the very first time that people sat around telling each other stories and somebody at the end went, oh, great story, but what if? You know, and expanded upon it. And, you know, we really, you know, I think in that way, that idea of transformative fiction is just a part of us. It's a part of our societal structure and how we build relationships and how we build rapport and community. And I think that fan fiction, as much as it can be beneficial in terms of building specific communities, also, I think is limiting and can be harmful in that so many people have such a negative view, and fan fiction in many circles has such a negative connotation with it, that I really think that we're trying, it's the point of this panel today, we're trying to get away from that.
I mean, we know what fiction is. So what we're actually defining or trying to define is the fan part. And when, fan studies was a relatively new discipline back in the early 90s, media fans had just begun to be kind of studied seriously as a community. So there was a fairly stringent definition. But because fandom is now so mainstream and in some ways so commercialized and so integrated into the rhythms of everyday life and into media production, a lot of people are questioning when we talk about fans or we talk about fandom, what are we actually talking about? And it seems like some people are talking about completely different kinds of activities or kinds of engagement to other people.
That's really true, Judith. So like I was just thinking from what you said, that when you've got so many fans, you're going to have multiple communities, so the people who really love radio for audio dramas like Cabin Pressure, and some of them might be the same as the people who write massive blockbuster movie fanfic, like Marvel Universe, but some of them are not, and some of those people do not speak to each other and have very different expectations about what their fanfic is there to do and how it's supposed to work.
Right.
But precisely because they're from such different backgrounds.
And if you look at, say, the Journal of Transformative Works and Cultures, particularly in recent years, you have people writing articles about 19th century writing circles or literary cultures as a form of fandom, and people talking about the collection of sneakers, as the American term is, for, I guess it's a kind of shoe, or like a collecting hobby as a form of fandom. And what do those things have in common with each other? Are we just going to use fandom for everything, for every form of engagement? Like, I do. That's why, if we want to define fan fiction, we have to define fandom, and I think that's increasingly difficult.
I do think there's a value in trying to be expansive, though, in terms of trying to sort of reclaim what fandom is and reclaim fan fiction as an artistic endeavor. I feel like my personal argument that ancient Romans would absolutely have been writing real person fanfic about their favorite gladiators sort of has a part to play in that, in that you're trying to sort of stake a claim, and you're trying to sort of argue for a role there.
But I think we need different terms, I think, is the point. It's not that I'm saying it's not a legitimate or defined activity. I definitely think it is, but I'm not sure like what the way to describe it is anymore.
Those are all very good points. Yeah, no, those are very good points. I want to go further, but I'm trying to be conscious of time and conscious of trying to talk about, different things and not just go like follow the one thing for the next 13 hours. So one thing that you said, Manda, which is basically one of the things that I'm always talking about with my friends, is that fan fiction is basically just the modern folk tale in a way, because as you say, people, see this thing, they see this story, they watch or read the story and they go, wow, this is amazing. Why is it already ending? I want more. I'll just make more. And which is why fanfiction is often, written within, from, and for communities. And I would love to hear more from you, specifically about your fanfic, The End Is Where We Begin, and how, like, your experience with the community aspect of writing a fanfic with a bunch of other people, having a bunch of other people as like your beta readers and just proofreaders and supporters and stuff like that. And also maybe if you want to explain a little bit what the fanfic is, and like, I know we already touched upon Supernatural, but just to be like, oh, it's a fix-it fanfic, and then maybe explain what a fix-it fanfic is, because I don't know if people are going to know all of these terms, because we can say all of them, but then people might just be like, what are they talking about?
Sure. Uh, So my fanfic, The End is Where We Begin, it is what has become known as a finale fix-it fanfic. So fix-its are any kind of fan fiction that does what it says on the tin. It fixes something from canon that that particular author took issue with. And so, these can be written after a single episode of a show in response to a movie or a book. In this case, it's specific to the ending of the series of Supernatural, which was an ending that a lot of people took a lot of different issues with. So I wrote this finale fix it. It is around 80,000 words. And when I set out to write this, I was actually writing it for a charity auction. So someone had donated money to charity and bid on authors and won essentially what is a free commission from a fanfic author. So I was writing it in response to not only what I wanted to see for the ending of the series, but what she wanted to see. And then I also wanted it to be more of a fix-it that responded to what our community felt was missing from the ending. So I did a couple months of essentially research where I did a lot of talking to people. I did a lot of listening. I did a lot of reading on Twitter and Tumblr and other social media sites. And I read published articles to see, what do people feel was lacking from this ending. So this was, in a sense, I wanted it to go beyond a story just about the relationship of these two particular characters and to really be about all of the characters and the show as a whole. So that was kind of my goal, was to fix as many things as I could for as many people as I could in a way that still felt authentic to the characters. And hopefully I accomplished that. So I have a few kind of writing circles and Discord groups. I think I have some folks from those who are attending today, and I'm very glad that they're here. And I pestered them constantly for months. So, every time I had a question about what I was writing, or I'm honestly not very strong in knowing, what happened where in the canon show. So kind of once I discovered the world of fandom and fan fiction, I went that direction and paid less attention to what was happening in canon. I can't quote episode titles or things like that. I have a vague idea of this happened somewhere around this point in the story arc. So I had to do a lot of digging to look up specific threads that were dropped, plot holes, and did a lot of asking people and getting help and responses into that. And it really, there were parts of the story that I completely rewrote because, for example, I had kind of my big bad in the story was something that I wasn't fully happy with. And, through talking with someone else, one of my friends mentioned that, this other particular villain, monster, creature was mentioned at one point in the series as being the worst of the worst and then just forgotten and never mentioned again. So, and she's like, and that drives me nuts. And I was like, ooh. So I went back and rewrote a couple of chapters to change the story and incorporate that. So, and there were a number of fixes for that, and I tried to pay attention to, especially people from marginalized communities, especially those that I'm not a member of, in what representation they felt was lacking. The show overall has received a lot of criticism for its treatment of women, of queer characters, and of BIPOC characters. So, it was important to me to try to provide, to fix some of those. For example, the longest standing, the only remaining Black character who had not been killed off earlier in the series was then villainized towards the end of the series. And so that was very hurtful to a lot of Black fans. And so that was one of the things that I wanted to fix and change with my story. So it was a very big communal effort. And I had multiple people who did beta reading and alpha reading and gave me feedback and gave me sensitivity reads and feedback on that. So, I mean, there was just so much that went into it. So it was a pretty big undertaking, but it was something that I didn't want to do in a vacuum. So I hope that answers it and is kind of what you were looking for.
Yeah, that was brilliant. I've started reading it. I'm still somewhere in the middle just because the supernatural ending has been so friggin' painful that I've not managed to get through your entire fic yet, because it brings everything up again. I'm just like, oh God, this is too much. I cannot deal with it. But it also means that you're doing a very, very good job, because I can definitely feel that you're trying to fix like all of these little plot points and stuff like that. And I just really love that about it as well, that you can just have all of these things that at some point are brought up, especially in Supernatural is one of the big ones, where there's just so many plot points are mentioned once and then forgotten forever. And you're just like, okay, but there's stuff we can talk about there. That'd be interesting. Something I would also like to bring everyone in is to just talk about, I guess, representation just in general, as you've already touched upon, that fan fiction can be really good, or is like sometimes one of the only places where people can get representation and like see themselves represented, just because mainstream media is way too cishet and white. So is there more that maybe Judith and Katie also would like to say about that?
I mean, I always have stuff to say about that. One thing that immediately springs to mind is that one of the first fanfics I read where I was very aware that, wait, you could do something really important with this as terms of queer representation, was in the West Wing fandom, where someone who then later ended up being a good friend, because I sort of wrote to her and went, your fanfic is really good. She had written basically not quite missing scenes fic. So, which is where, you think, oh, well, maybe this thing happened and I'm going to write out what that thing happened in between the scenes that actually happened, but basically postulated that there was a romance within the show that was happening that you didn't see all of, and sort of making that make sense. And it wasn't a happy story. It's called The Turning Verse, because the first part of it is called Turning Myself Into You. And it's Josh and Sam from the West Wing, and about how they had a messy breakup and like this sort of kind of doomed love, in a way, and how that makes a lot of the stuff in the show make sense. And I went, that is brilliant. And I really found in that something that said that you could do this. You were allowed to say there is actually a place for queer stories in here, and that's valid. And I'm making a sort of staking that out as saying that there is something valid there.
I mute myself. When this topic comes up, I always feel like my answer is a bit yeah, but no. Like, I mean, the title of my PhD, which the book grew out of, or the subtitle, was Fanfiction and the Paradox of Legitimation, because I feel like, without wishing to sound pessimistic, we are all products of the same disciplinary structures. It's not to say that our thinking is like absolutely trapped within them, but what I found when I made a highly systematic and quantitative qualitative investigation of different kinds of fan fiction, both for the PhD and the book, is that certainly there is transformative potentials, and there are transformative potentials, but we can't assume too easily that there is anything automatically radical about the form. Fan fiction is, by its very form, is transformative of the structures of authority and authorship, which, as we know, tend to be white, masculine, patriarchal, and so on. But its content can be surprisingly affirmative of them. And I say can be, not has to be. So as much as, I'm excited by the transformative potentials of fanfic and the transformative potentials of experimental writing and communal writing and so on, I think we have to attend to the material as it comes and not kind of rush into like a celebration of, oh, look at this radical transformation, because, in the very early days of fan fiction studies, when it was really not a legitimate subject of academia at all, whereas now it definitely is, academics were definitely over celebratory and, you know, definitely cherry picked examples that supported their arguments for, you know, communalism and radicalism and anti-authoritarianism. And that is understandable to an extent because they were attempting to defend their investment in a very stigmatized object. Academia has moved past the stigmatization of fan culture, largely, at least within the humanities. And, you know, anything involving media and popular culture is stigmatized by some branches of academia, and I don't really care about them. So, you know, whatever. But whilst I think it's great to recognize the as I say, the potentials of the form, let's not make a priori judgments about its ability for, you know, improved representation and challenges of the historical structures of authority. Let's treat the material as it is what I'm saying. And we need as well to attend, in the interest of fairness, we need to attend to the kind of fanfic that troubles us, as well as the kind of fanfic that we would like to celebrate.
Judith, do you think that's also partly because we just have so much more fanfic accessible to us now? So, you know, when you've got,
Sure.
you know, you've got hundreds and thousands, if not millions of people on AO3, and when you've got a big group like that, there's always going to be sort of all kinds of things, you know, things that you like, things that you don't like, things that you find problematic, things that you find
Sure.
positive.
Of course, number is part of it, and the fact as well, as I say, that whilst we're all individuals, we all live within the same white patriarchal heteronormative culture, and we are all influenced by that culture. As much as we try to, you know, we can't entirely step outside of our own, you know, enculturated positions, as much as we can try to challenge ourselves. And I think that the same patterns of dominance that we see in broader society, we can't automatically assume that fan fiction is going to be an overturning of that. It may well be a replication of it in some spaces and in some ways. And that's, like I said, was why I came up with this idea of the legitimation paradox when I was working on the book, in the sense that the form of fan fiction is a challenge to the sole legitimation of the white masculine heteronormative author, but by its very form, it is also dependent on that, by its very engagement with it. So yeah, and there have been similar arguments made about post-colonial literature, by the way, that, you know, in books like The Empire Writes Back, which is a kind of a confession of post-colonial literature, that post-colonial literature is a challenge to the canon, to the Western canon, that is also dependent on and implicated within it. Do you know what I mean?
I think that's a really good point, Judith. And I think that, you know, and that's something that, I mean, I can see within my own writing that we are all subject to our own implicit biases, and we're all a part
Yeah,
of those structures. And yeah, and I can look at my earlier stories and I can see how my writing and perspectives have changed. And
of course, yeah.
yeah, and I think I've engaged in a lot of conversations in fandom, and I think there definitely is this mindset that, well, because I'm writing fan fiction and because I'm writing about a gay ship, that, you know, therefore you can do no wrong, that, you know, you're by nature you are somehow more legitimate or more progressive, and that's not always the case. You know, I've had some there's a lot of issues in fan fiction, I think, with the um, with fetishization, with feminization of gay men. And these are criticisms that gay men in particular have brought up that I have seen, especially some, you know, cishet female fan fiction authors get very defensive over.
Yeah,
But yeah, but they're legitimate conversations. And I think if you are writing in a void without considering that,
yeah,
then, you know, not without being aware of that, then yeah, you're definitely falling into the trap of perpetuating.
of course. And I mean, like, I'm a woman of color in academia, but that doesn't exempt me from the structures of racism and misogyny. And I always remember how one time I wrote a story that I was really proud of, and then I realized that I killed the girl at the beginning as a plot device.
I've done the exact same thing. And, you know, I know you're familiar with supernatural fan fiction. So fridging of female characters is a big criticism of the source material. And then I think we as fan fiction authors sometimes fall into that trap of thinking that, well, you know, it's not my fault. I'm writing from the source material. And it's like, isn't that the point of us, though, is to correct those things. And so now I'm not as quick to, you know, for example, kill off Mary, the mother who died and started the series. You know, I try to, you know, if someone, if a character of color was villainized in the story, that does not make it okay for me to automatically make them a villain in my story when there are other characters I could choose from. So I think it's definitely, I found that in my own writing as well.
Yeah, and I've always asked myself, like, why do I write about white characters so much? Why do I consume so much media involving white characters? I'm not white. Why do I do that? Well, because that's what's available to me partly, and that, you know, that's what is kind of there for me to emphasize with. But I think as well, there's a question of what is fan fiction for? Because I remember the argument you made earlier about it being a kind of pure pleasure and, you know, pure kind of libidinous enjoyment. And then if we how far do we have a responsibility to correct ourselves? Like, it comes back, I guess, to the question of what you believe the responsibility of fiction to be, especially fiction that you're not producing for any material gain.
And again, with any community as big as fandom as a whole, you're going to have a lot of different answers to that. You're going to have people coming at it from very different points of view. And I do think that fandom as a whole is sort of, it has a bit of a tendency to think that, oh, we're all coming through it together for love of this one canon. Therefore, we have that in common. Therefore, we speak the same language. When sometimes that's just literally not true. And people are still coming at it from extremely different points of view, but because they have that one thing in common and want to have that in common, and that's the basis of the community, that's the basis of that feeling of togetherness and that creativity, that I think it can then be hard to step back and go, well, actually maybe we can also harm each other, maybe we are still within these structures, and people don't really like thinking that.
I think that the community is always a slightly problematic term, and that's actually something that we've been reckoning with on the project that I'm working on now, which is to do with open access book publishing, so making academic books available to free for everyone, and the people that, you know, make that happen in a sustainable way. This problem of community and who is the community is quite a tricky term, because we'd all like it's quite a nice sounding, harmonious, fluffy term, community, but when you come down to it, can using the term community kind of steamroller over the needs and desires of some people? Do you know what I mean? While basically kind of catering to the loudest voices.
Yeah, I mean, people can't sort of agree on what a community is or what harm is, or any of these things. So of course there's going to be arguments about it.
And I mean, maybe I actually think that possibly in all kinds of fan culture, the term community, some people have said that the way that social media has developed is a lot less conducive to community than it used to be. That, you know, if you think back to the days of LiveJournal and MySpace, early MySpace now, not what MySpace has become, that they're way more conducive to the idea of community than, say, TikTok or Twitter.
Yeah, and I think that people who are in the journaling communities especially have a bit of a tendency to really mourn that, because they were such a great space to have sort of a more nuanced discussion, because you have just physically more space to talk about it. And I guess time as well, because Twitter goes incredibly fast.
It does. And, you know, anybody can join in a discussion on anything on Twitter and just like say something stupid and log off, you know, like it's a very low investment platform if you want it to be.
That's it. Yeah, it does move fast. And by the time I develop an opinion on a topic, typically Twitter has moved on. So I don't participate in a lot of Twitter discourse, not because I lack opinions, but because by the time I've put my thoughts in order, everyone else is on to something else. So I'm like,
Yeah.
okay. And yeah, there's absolutely, to Katie's point, there's no space for nuance there. And I think that a lot of these conversations are things that require that nuance.
Should we try and take some of the questions, like from the Q&A or the chat?
I was about to go there.
Okay, good. I was just gonna say, like, because I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna let you finish your points. But yes, if we move on to the Q&A aspect of the event, because I see that we've got a couple of questions in. So I'm going to start off with a question by Ed. So I think this kind of comes back a little bit to what you were saying at the beginning, Judith. So it says, what term or terms would you find more useful when discussing fan fiction or fan art and fan work in general?
I quite like transformative work and cultures, as the journal has it. I think that captures quite a lot. But the problem is that a transformative work could be literally anything again. So, I mean, I don't have an answer for you of what I think the right kind of term is, or even if there could be a right word. But I like the point that Casey made earlier, that it's more possibly of a form than it is the genre. So the way that comic books are a form, or the way that novellas are a form. I think in terms of content, it's literally impossible to qualify, because, you know, the content could be anything. So I think that thinking of it as like a form, as something like transformative writing or something like transformative works, is probably as close as we are at the moment. But I don't think that there's kind of a good set answer right now. I mean, I've only just really come to kind of doubt the term fan, to be honest. That's kind of a recent development in my thinking.
I think I'd also add in that sometimes it's a useful distinction to make between for-profit and not-for-profit, and in terms of sort of copyright issues. But I also feel like that's a very just sort of an extremely separate concern than aesthetics, or how you might think about it as an artistic endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, copyrights in the broadest scheme of things, the copywriting of written text is kind of a historical anomaly. It's only about it's only about 300 years old. Like, you know, in this, and what it was 300 years ago is extremely minimal compared to what it is today. In the scheme of people writing things, that's a blip on the radar.
Yeah, I agree with both of those points. I like the term transformative, sorry, as well. But yes, it's very, very broad, and that does lend itself to problems. But that's the term that I prefer the most, that I think is the most useful.
Yeah, I think it's just, again, there's like so many, whenever you have something like that where it can be so broad and just people have a lot of different opinions and everything, it's always good to just keep talking about it and just keep trying to define it. But it might be difficult to just have like, okay, this is the one definition and we're going to stick with that. And I think it's always good to just keep defining things anyway. I'll just move on to the next question then. So we've got a question here from Shar. In recent years, there's been a huge surge in RPF, so real person fiction, in the fanfic world. Some have even gone on to become novels and adapted into films. What place do you think this type of fic has in fandom culture? And do you have any personal opinions on RPF as a subgenre? And I guess that could just be to whoever wants to take it.
I guess my main opinion is that I don't think that it's going anywhere. I mean, people have written RPF literally as long as people have been writing fic of different sorts. You know, if you start saying that, I mean, yes, I think that there can be different moral considerations for you on an individual level, in terms of, you know, do I want to make sure that this person's family don't see it if they Google it, something like that. But in terms of where it fits in within the fandom community, I think that that's just always been part of how fans engage with the object of their fanishness.
I mean, I basically agree in the sense that I think it's not a subgenre, it's the exact same thing, because everybody knows that it's about the mediated construction of either general celebrities or subcultural celebrities. And I mean, I've written an article called Reading RPF as Digital Fiction, which argues that whatever difference it has is a matter of form, not of content, and particularly the affordances of digital media that allow us this sort of unmediated access to real media regarding real people is what enables it. But I have studied RPF quite a lot, and I find no qualitative difference between RPF and any other kind of fan fiction.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that RPF is going anywhere. I think it is just as central to fan fiction as stories about fictional characters. And I think when you're discussing RPF, I think most of the discussions that I see are more moral discussions, not necessarily. And when people say it doesn't belong as fan fiction, they're usually speaking from a moral standpoint, not from a content standpoint.
Yeah. But I find that a strange argument, because literally everybody knows that it has nothing to do with any individual that exists in the actual world. And sometimes people have said, like, how would you feel if someone wrote about you? I wouldn't care. I wouldn't read it, but I, you know, but I wouldn't care either. It would be, in a way, it would be nothing to do with me.
How would I feel if someone wrote RPF about me? Probably jealous of my fictional self, because
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, I think, honestly, I think the main thing there is just don't go to the, like, real person and just, like, put it into their face and be like, here, I'm gonna read this to you. It's like, no, please don't do that. But apart from that,
yeah, it's nothing to do with them in any, I mean, it's in the same way as, you know,
It's when I used to read RPF, I was also never thinking about them even as real people. I was always kind of thinking about them as, like, fictional versions of themselves still, yeah.
And that's why I say it's not qualitatively different to any other kind of fan fiction. If there is a difference, it's a difference of form. Yeah, someone's just put the thing in.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got questions from Anon, some Anon, so I'm going to go with the first one. I'd like to go back to the question of representation of minorities in fanfic. Do you think the LGBTQ+ rep in fic has had an influence on traditional publishing? And I think, again, just whoever wants to jump in.
Honestly, yes. In as much as I think that a lot of the people who grew up fanishly are now in publishing and are now making some of those decisions in a way that wasn't true, you know, 20 years ago. But I think probably the nerds have always had sort of some of the same elements. Like, I don't think that it's necessarily like a huge sort of sea change. But I think that maybe some of the way that we see that being played out maybe has been influenced by the fact that a lot of these people know what fanfic is, maybe have written some, know what fandom is in a way that they maybe wouldn't have, or their equivalents wouldn't have.
It's hard to gauge cause and effect, but what I will say is that the increasing economic power of fandom has certainly changed industrial media in all kinds of ways, because, you know, fans are no longer a niche demographic. Fans, or at least certain kinds of fans, are now very much a money-wielding demographic that corporations are increasingly obliged to take notice of. For better or worse, by the way, you know.
Yeah, and then there's definitely still, like, moments where you're like, they don't do that, because every time I'm just like, Supernatural, you could have had so much money, but you didn't want it. So, you know. But I think just with Supernatural as well, like with Destiel, I think there's definitely a lot as well, just the fact that we got the declaration. I do think that there's a relation to just how much fans we're pushing that and just loving it, and so they try to give us as much as possible or whatever, but that's a whole other conversation. So I'm just going to move on to the next.
Well, I mean, that's one reason why Supernatural is an interesting case study, because it has been so engaged.
It's such an interesting case,
yeah, with its fan demographic, and has made a great deal of money out of its, you know, engagement with its fan demographic. Yeah, and you know, the representation of fans in the show. So I gave up before the end, but I can definitely see like how people felt a betrayal there.
Oh yeah, no, Supernatural is just in general a very interesting phenomenon, I think, that you could talk about for hours. Right, I will go to the next one quickly. So again from Anon, fanfic seems to be a place where people can express or explore themselves sexually. Do you have any comments on that? Assume this means like with sexuality, I would.
Well, I think that question could apply to sexuality. It could apply to kink. So I think there are kind of multiple interpretations of that question. And I think that, I mean, absolutely, people do, both through reading and writing fan fiction, explore different aspects of their identity, and sexuality and how we relate to sex is certainly a part of that. You know, for speaking of sexuality, I mentioned earlier that when I first started reading and writing fan fiction, you know, I thought I was just, you know, straight, and now I'm now identify as asexual or demi-gray, and without fan fiction and fandom and the relationships that I established through that, that might not be the case. I probably would have a different understanding of myself still. And I think that certainly when it comes to, I think fiction in general is a way that people explore things that they don't necessarily feel comfortable exploring physically or, you know, in real life yet. So, and however you want to define that. So I think through reading and watching media, that's certainly a form of exploration in general.
Yeah. And I think fanfic specifically, because the barrier to entry is deliberately low. You don't have to try and get published. You don't have to try and meet a specific criteria of any sort. I think that does encourage people who are in that space of trying to explore and wanting to learn, and on all sorts of levels, to do that.
I will just add, please don't get your sex education from fan fiction. If you read something,
a very important point.
If you read something in fan fiction, you go, oh, that's interesting. Like, do some actual research beyond that as a follow-up.
That's a very important point, Manda. Thank you. I think we're just gonna try to squeeze in one more question there. Again from Anand, asking, how do fandom run events relate to all of this? Like how some fandoms will have weeks specifically to encourage the production of more works for a certain character or ship. Anyone who wants to jump in on this?
Relate in what way?
Yeah, I find that a slightly confusing question.
Yeah.
Because they're part of how we make it a community, people doing the same thing together, and sort of feeling part of the same thing. But people do that in all sorts of different ways, like depending on the fandom and who they feel like, you know, talking about that day.
And other kinds of writing communities do similar things as well. But I'm super sorry, I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes because I have got another meeting.
Which is completely fair.
So I'll just add, sorry, just as a quick add-on to that. Yeah, I mean, fandom run events are, I think, integral to fandom. Like I'm participating right now, getting ready to run a virtual Destiel virtual convention at the beginning of November that is celebrating Destiel fan creators and fan creations in art and fan fiction. So I think that it's great, and it's something that's going to continue to grow, I think, and I hope it does continue to grow. And I just want to add, the last anon question we have there about fetishization, we can't answer that now, but if you want to follow up with me, find me on Twitter at the MandalaRose, and I'll be happy to answer that for you there.
That is great. Thank you so much. So I will just run through a quick list of thank yous before we end this panel and let you all go. So I want to thank you, first of all, Judith, Katie, and Manda. Thank you so much for coming and for speaking to us today and for this wonderful discussion. I wish we had more time, but it's the same as always. Sadly, there's not enough time to talk about all of the things that we'd like to talk about. I would also like to thank the audience for joining us today, and thanks to Liz for being my co-chair and helping me manage the Q&A session. Thank you to Leslie Carrera for providing BSL interpretation, to the media services and the WayWORD team behind the scenes, which at the moment should be Kirsty, B, Helen and McKenna. A big thank you as well to Creative Scotland, the WORD Centre and the University of Aberdeen for their generous funding of WayWORD, and to the dedicated team of students, young people and staff who program and deliver the whole festival. A particular thanks as well for the partnership and support of the English Literature Society at Aberdeen University. Thanks again for attending, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this talk as much as I have, and we'll hope that you join us for other great festival arts events during the rest of the week, which are all free. And you can follow us on social media at WayWORD ABDN. Thank you so much again, everybody, and take care and goodbye.